Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina from UC San Diego. It is October 22nd, 2024, which makes it October 23rd in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu. I'm Ulrike Shaede, professor at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, from which this Zoomina is coming to you. Let me tell you a little bit about ourselves while participants still are finding their Zoom seats. We are at GPS, School of Global Policy and Strategy, which has grown over the years from the original IRPS into a international affairs and public policy school, and you see the numbers there. We have, as one of our degrees, a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. We do a lot of fun stuff. So you can follow us on or join us and see what we're doing at jfit.ucsd.edu. Our events are recorded, and there are two aspects to this. The first is that you are, during this event, invited to please type any questions you might have into the Q&A box. If I read your question out, I will, unless you tell me otherwise, I will refer to you only by your first name to protect your privacy. On the good news side, that means that all of our events are in something called the JZ Gallery. And so you can go back and listen to older versions, iterations, topics, whatever you want to think about that. Some of you may be regulars. And so, of course, today we are going to talk about eco-disasters in Japanese cinema. But let me remind you that our final event of this quarter will be not on November 5th, so we're going to skip Election Day. And we'll have Philip Lipsky, professor of political science at the University of Toronto and Tokyo, with us on November 12th. And we will talk about Japan in the changing international order. With that, let's go to Professor Rachel DeNitto, who is here with me today to talk about her recent book, Eco-Disasters in Japanese Cinema, recently edited volume, and she will tell us all about it. But before she does, let me tell you a little bit about Rachel. So Rachel DeNitto is professor of Japanese literature at the University of Oregon. She holds a BA at the University of Pennsylvania. I guess she's originally hails from the East Coast, but then work and interest and whatnots pulled her west. Her MA and PhD are from the University of Washington, and now, of course, she's Oregon. She is an expert on she calls it the environmental humanities. I find that a very interesting phrase, and especially nuclear issues. And that has brought her, as we learned from the introduction to this book, to teaching a class on eco-disasters in Japanese cinema. And that then became this volume, which is edited, and I wanted to say, in the series called Asia Shorts, which is supported by the Association of Asian Studies. And we want to thank Sam for bringing Rachel to us here. So Rachel, without further ado, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Ulrike, for having me here, and thanks everyone for zooming in. I also want to put a shout out to the whole AAS Asia Shorts team, David Kenley, John Wilson, Jan Barsley. It was just a fabulous team to work with and such a great experience. Just want to put a plug in if anyone's thinking about a book in that series. Just really want to encourage people to do that. Just a terrific team. So I'm going to give just a short overview of the book. Give you some idea of what some of the issues we deal with and some of the films are in the chapters, and then we'll come back and Ulrike and I will have a conversation. So let me share my screen here. Here we go. Let me go back. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see. We're good. Okay, perfect. So many of you all watching and many readers have commented in the ways that they're really familiar with how Japanese cinema is known for these spectacular scenes of disaster. So we have, Godzilla's rampage through Tokyo, multiple cataclysms of an animated futuristic Neo-Tokyo in films like Akira, these animated films, to the destruction of the entire archipelago in works like the Japan Sinks series. So these ubiquitous images of nature as a destructive force seem to run counter to Japan's purportedly harmonious relationship with nature. And this is a relationship that has actually been cited as an explanation for why the Japanese are well suited to handle these natural disasters. But I want to ask, I think we should ask, how does this discourse of Japanese harmony function within the context of clearly man-made environmental disasters and the realities of what critics have called Japan's war on nature? So I was really interested in how these disaster films can work as environmental commentary and how we can expand or redefine the concept of the disaster film to examine environmental issues. The book argues that Japanese directors have used images of disaster and destruction to produce timely visual commentary on a multitude of environmental threats, from the slow violence of industrial pollution to the instantaneous decimation of the atomic bombs. There has been important work done on environmental issues, specifically in documentary cinema, but I wanted to think broadly across a range of genres that have the capacity to send different messages and to reach different audiences. So just want a couple slides here. These are the different genres that are covered in the volume, exceeding sort of any one genre or any one approach, ranging from documentary and activist cinema to monster films to things we might think of as really just entertainment and studio blockbusters. Here's a list of the films that we cover in the volume, and then also a list of the directors that are also in the volume. So environmental messages in documentary films tend to be really clear and very upfront, but that may not always be the case for other genres. That said, that doesn't mean that the message is missing. And the films in this volume do not all necessarily arise from or seek to promote an environmental consciousness, and some only address eco-disasters indirectly or peripherally, but we examine them all as vehicles for environmental commentary. And the chapters really emphasize the diversity of voices and topics when it comes to films that feature the systemic assault on the environment. So this volume is an important addition to a growing body of scholarship. These volumes that I have here were instrumental in widening the scope of eco-cinema and environmental studies into East Asia, and we're very excited to join this group. In terms of the structure of the book, it covers films from 1954 to 2020. And I had kind of various thoughts about how to structure the book, which I'm happy to talk more about later, but decided rather than a historical chronology to organize it around 4 intersecting themes, these themes here. It's not strictly chronological, but it is attentive to important historical inflection points of Japan's environmental disasters, such as Minamata disease and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster. So the volume starts with Minamata, and I just want to give a brief overview for Minamata for those who may not be familiar with it. Minamata disease, when we speak about this, we talk about the Chiso Corporation in 1932 dumping methyl mercury-laden wastewater into Minamata Bay that then destroyed marine life and the fishing community that was dependent on the sea. Methyl mercury was discovered as the source of the destruction in 1959, but Chiso, the government, and medical institutions concealed that information until the late 60s. And I was just looking online, there are still lawsuits ongoing today. There is one in 2024, and the Japanese court ordered compensation for unrecognized victims. Minamata is one of Japan's 4 big pollution diseases, along with Itai disease from cadmium discharged into the local water source and agricultural soil by Mitsui Mining in 1912, Niigata Minamata disease caused by methyl mercury poisoning of the Agano River Basin by industrial plants in 1956, and Yokkaichi asthma air pollution from sulfur dioxide emissions from petrochemical and industrial complexes in 1961. The volume is attentive to the ways that Japan's rapid modernization was lauded as a post-war economic miracle, but the ways that its capitalist excesses yielded a spate of environmental catastrophes that polluted Japan's air, land, waterways, seas, and residents. And these catastrophes are illuminated and critiqued across the multiple modes and genres of cinema that we talk about in this volume. Minamata and Fukushima were the watershed moments in Japan's environmental history, but the volume also addresses the environmental harm that eco-cinema scholars talk about as everyday eco-disasters. So in the post-war years, Japan experienced air pollution severe enough that school children collapsed when playing outdoors, and there's a scene referencing this in the Smog Monster film. Ocean waters were clogged with waste, red tides, and sludge so extreme that Tokyo and Osaka both proclaimed their bays to be dead bodies of water. And this is referenced in series like the space battleship Yamato. And in more recent years, Japanese consumer culture has exacerbated the plague of single-use plastic pollution, and the archipelago is particularly vulnerable to the rising coastal waters of climate change. So I want to give an overview of the chapters and the issues that they deal with. As I mentioned earlier, the volume opens with Minamata disease. Christine Barron's chapter examines the famed documentary filmmaker Tsuchimoto Noriaki's film Minamata Diaries from 2004. This was the last of his 12-plus films that he dedicated to this issue. And she contrasts what she calls Tsuchimoto's eco-critical temporality with the recent American production, the film Minamata, some of you may have seen, about photojournalist Eugene Smith. And Marin argues that this film erases the decades-long history of suffering and struggle in Minamata. And the film was quite controversial in Japan as well. Other films that address issues of industrial pollution, both local and planetary, include Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, which I mentioned earlier, and Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind. These films are often discussed as part of a series, in the Godzilla case, or as the altruistic vision of Miyazaki Hayao for Nausicaa. But in the volume, we place these films alongside the evolution of the environmental movement in Japan, dating back to the 1960s. So in John Abel's chapter, he concludes that the Smog Monster film provides a more useful framework for dealing with systemic environmental problems than the theorist Timothy Morton's concept of the hyperobject. And Roman Rosenbaum discusses Miyazaki's personal experience of war and pacifism and his own struggles to really own this label of environmentalist, even though many apply that label to him based on films like Nausicaa. So similarly, Devinder Bhowmik's chapter on Koreeda's Air Doll looks at the use of a plastic doll in place of a human as a critique of Japan's throwaway culture. And my chapter on Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Charisma compares the natural scapes that are poisoned in the film to the wildlife buffers around irradiated zones. Radiation is a really important segue here to another major focus in the volume, which is the recognition of nuclear harm as a form of environmental damage. And this includes the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 that are addressed in Adam Bingham's chapter on Kurosawa Akira's penultimate film, Rhapsody in August. And in this film, Kurosawa attempts to represent the unrepresentable, which is the bombing of Nagasaki. We also consider American nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean, specifically Japan's third nuclear exposure, symbolized by the Lucky Dragon incident in 1954, that then spawned the Godzilla series of radioactive monster films, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The volume addresses both bombs and nuclear power, and it's important to remember the history of nuclear power in Japan. Starting in the 50s, the US government ran a very successful propaganda campaign to embed nuclear power in Japan, overcoming the memory of the atomic bombs and widespread public opposition to the nuclear. Since the 1970s, Japan has experienced numerous accidents at their nuclear power plants that have led to radioactive releases and fatalities, including cover-ups at the Mihama, Monju, and Tokaimura plants, culminating in the Fukushima Daiichi explosions and meltdowns in 2011. So to recognize this nuclear history, the volume looks at films about nuclear power plants both before and after the Fukushima accident. Eugenio D'Angelis' chapter analyzes the internationally understudied film Hasegawa Kazuhiko's The Man Who Stole the Sun, which takes this very farcical approach to nuclear terrorism. And in the film, the protagonist steals plutonium from a nuclear power plant and builds a weapon. And then he threatens to use it and issues these various demands of the authorities, one of which is that they must have a Rolling Stones concert in Japan, otherwise he's going to set off the bomb. It's a really interesting film, and it uses this Black humor to kind of problematize the nuclear in Japan. Jeff Du Bois introduces Morisaki Azuma's film Nuclear Gypsies, which you see here with the Japanese title, which is quite a complicated title. It's known in the English title Nuclear Gypsies. This film is not well known outside of Japan, and it extends the definition of nuclear victim, or hibakusha, beyond atomic bomb victims, as it depicts the violence done to nuclear power plant workers and the community of outcasts, many of whom are from Okinawa in the film, and these outcasts live in the shadow of the Mihama plant on the Japan seaside. So as I mentioned earlier, the Fukushima accident was a watershed moment in Japan that I have written about elsewhere, and a number of chapters analyze films made in Fukushima's wake, and some connect them to earlier films. So to go back to Godzilla, Sean Wren's chapter compares the original Godzilla with Ano Hideaki's Shin Godzilla, and also the American production, Legendary Pictures production of Godzilla, to show how the two of them, these remakes, conceal or even erase radiation victims and nuclear violence in Japan and the Pacific. And the volume unfortunately didn't work out timing-wise that we could include Godzilla -1, but that would be another really interesting film to talk about. Another chapter that connects pre- and post-Fukushima disaster is Andrea Rai's chapter on documentary filmmaker Kamanaka Hitomi's films Ashes to Honey from 2010 and Little Voices from Fukushima from 2015. And both of these films show local communities fighting to sustain lives and livelihoods. In Ashes to Honey, it's a small island community of Iwaishima fighting off a construction of a nuclear power plant before the Fukushima disaster. And in Little Voices, it's these families trying to live in the disaster zone after the accident. An important Fukushima trilogy is the work by cult director Sono Shion, including Himizu, Land of Hope, and Whispering Star. And in her chapter on these films, Aidana Bolabetsky tracks these disasters across a series of ruined landscapes that engage both the realism of the actual 2011 disaster and the fiction of this off-world machine-dominated future. These disasterscapes from 2011 really dominated documentary cinema, and many directors were criticized for a voyeurism for including these shots in their films. And Sono was criticized himself for perhaps being too early to show some of these images in film. So this disasterscape or disasterscapes in general are important for Dong-Hoon Kim's chapter on Asako 1 and 2. This is by Hamaguchi Yusuke, the award-winning director of Drive My Car. And Kim reconsiders disaster as an emerging trope of Japanese melodrama and reveals the external and internal ruined landscapes of the disaster area and its residents as it shifts attention to the emotional and the affective aspects of the disasters. So the volume engages disasters actual and imagined, and a number of chapters take up animated or partially animated films that deal with issues of childhood. And this is important because images of mother and children were dominant in the wake of the nuclear disaster, as they were after the atomic bombs as well. So Christopher Smith's exploration of Ano Hideaki's Evangelion franchise, this cultural phenomenon, Evangelion, reveals the increasingly prominent disaster story of intergenerational ecological conflict in which children must repair the damage of the older generation in order to restore Earth's ecological health. And Laura Lee takes up international artist Murakami Takashi's film Jellyfish Eyes, which also focuses on children of a scarred society, a kind of post-Fukushima scarred society. And in the film, the children are tricked by this sinister and secret government research lab, but it shows that the kind of play that the children engage in represents this value of a kind of re-enchantment that's necessary to avoid the environmental annihilation. Other kind of futuristic disasters, we can think about Kaoru Tamura's chapter on Space Battleship Yamato. This is this beloved 1970s, mid-1970s anime series that is often discussed for its war themes, certainly given the name of the ship. But Tamura draws our attention to the environmental anxiety of the era, symbolized by this recurring image of an uninhabitable brown marble that signals the end of the Earth, right? The opposite of the famous Earthrise photos taken by the Apollo missions in the 60s and 70s. And those Apollo images were really instrumental to a global environmental movement. So we can see this also kind of responding to that. Other futuristic images include Amrita Iyer's chapter that explores the relationship between humans and technology in Seshita Hiroyuki's animated film Blame, where humans have become nearly extinct as a result of an apocalyptic urban sprawl caused by these sentient machines. And these films are sort of set in a contaminated, apocalyptic future as a way to address, I think, the precarity of our environmental present. So last but certainly not least, I want to mention the Japan Sinks franchise, a series known for its blockbuster images of destruction, based on Komatsu Sakyo's famous 1973 novel Nihon Chinbotsu. And Hideaki Fujiki analyzes the imagination of planetary change as it evolves through the 1973, 2006, and 2020 versions. And it shifts from a national fate to the material conditions necessary for this new, contingent, techno-utopian Japan that is able to survive economic collapse, or I'm sorry, environmental collapse. There are other films that could certainly be examined within an environmental lens that we are unable to include, things like Shinkai Makoto's films, Your Name or Weathering with You, and happy to talk more about those during the Q&A. Just want to mention that I think the volume, for those interested in teaching, could be taught as a course in itself or chapters included in other related volumes. I have an article in the MLA, Modern Language Association Options for Teaching series about teaching post-war Japanese fiction for anyone who's interested. That's more about literature, but could be paired with these films. And last, I want to say that there is currently a discount code available for the book until the end of December. So I cleared this with Ulrike, and those who are interested in purchasing the book, you're welcome to get a 20% off discount by visiting the Columbia website. So I will end here, and thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you. Tour de force through the book, which is really a fascinating book. And I'm sure the questions and answers will come in, but let me kind of use my role here, my prerogative of, kind of, okay, I have a very big question for you. And I'm gonna ask the big question, and I'm gonna go back and kind of tell you why I'm asking this big question. The big question is, as you step back from the book and these movies that you've watched, how is this different from eco disaster movies in the United States? And because that's a lot of, a large portion of our audience are kind of maybe thinking, what have I seen? And the reason I am asking this is that we had a Japan Zoomina with John Treat, who I believe is in the audience, and your PhD advisor, I guess. And he came on during COVID, and we discussed this topic of precarity. And he made me realize that precarity in Japan seems to be a little bit different from what precarity may be here. I'm asking this as a question, right? And so then, therefore, if there's a different perception of danger, maybe because there are so many earthquakes or so many typhoon or tsunami or what, all the bad things that happen to Japan at a fairly regular basis. Maybe is there a different sense of disaster, or do you not see that as a big difference?
Yeah, really hard to say. I think that, we can maybe point to certain things that people have talked about as specific to Japan. So, for example, Susan Napier talks about this apocalyptic genre as being, specific to Japan. And you can see, Neo Tokyo destroyed over and over and over again, especially in animation, right? And she argues that this is really embedded in, Japanese culture because of what you're saying, Ulrike, this history of, being on this very precarious, environmentally precarious land, right? What was interesting, and as I read through as the volume came together, was that there was so much variety in the films. So you do certainly have some apocalyptic themes and some post-apocalyptic situations, right? But then you have other films that really resist the spectacle of the apocalypse, right? The apocalypse doesn't come, right? It doesn't happen. So, there are ways that, maybe we could talk about nuclear films, maybe more specific to Japan because of Japan's history with the nuclear, right? again, I think we got to think a little bit about, the difference between, for example, a documentary film about the Japanese nuclear disaster, like Kamanaka Hitomi's films, or documentary films made by Americans about 3 Mile Island or the Hanford Plan or other things. And those share a lot of similarities, actually. Yeah, so I was trying to think through this question that, are there things that are specific to Japan? Um, you and I talked a little bit on email about a sense of resignation because, the Japanese live in this place with all these disasters. And then as I took another look through the volume, you have a lot of instances of rather than resignation, just kind of action, right? So the Minamata films, people protesting, people acting out, right? Kamanaka's films, people protesting, people engaging in these things, right? Um, you know, even the smog monster films, right? The scientists and the SDF, right? They're going to take action and they're going to Godzilla himself, right? Taking action to kind of stop these things. So I do think there is this anxiety in a lot of these films about the precarity of life, of the environment, of these communities' ability to survive. But I was really taken by the amount of action that happens in the films, right? And people are really seemingly doing something to change that situation. Doesn't always solve it, um, but it was interesting for me to think about it along those lines as well.
So they don't end on a happy note necessarily, but maybe on a gambare note or sort of
Yeah,
persevere, kind of
right.
ishokanmei, something
Yeah.
do it together or something. Is that the
I think some of them do end on a happy-ish note, like like the Godzilla films and Godzilla stops the disaster, right? Although as we were talking earlier, there's always a sequel, right? Um,
well,
but
that has to be right for Toho to sell another movie. They have
That's
to,
right. That's
I
right.
guess
Absolutely. And
that's
the fans
marketing.
want it too, right?
Yeah.
Um, but and I think some of the films do have this sense of we can see people acting to try and change things, to try and make the situation better, to try and correct, like in the Evangelion series, to try and correct all the mistakes of the past, of the parents, of the previous generation, right? Whether that is always successful or not, I think is an open question. But I was struck by myself reading through this again that less than resignation, I think I see action or this will to survive somehow.
No, that's very interesting. So I'm more of a business sort of soap kind of fan, right? So I watch and I claim to myself that that's good for language acquisition. I don't know, but there's a big difference between a Japanese and a Korean, sort of office soap, where the Korean is much soapier and happier, and it's like, and Japan always has some filial obligation that is not being met, some hierarchical thing to overcome, there's always something to overcome, even in a fairly silly sort of office, kind of series. And I think the eco disaster movies bring that out sort of in
Mm,
full force, right? There's something to overcome, and often these other things are mixed in, I guess, these societal
mm.
pressures and the constraints of what's good behavior and what you can do in these moments and so forth, right? It's kind of, and I don't think we have that in US movies, this complication. But maybe I'm a little bit out of my depth here, so, so I don't know whether that's true. So we get questions. Actually, the aforementioned John has a question for you. There is a 2009 film about a lethal pandemic in Japan. Deze Takahisa's Kensen Retto. Did you consider including that a film about plagues, and in other words, about disasters with no explicit human agency, or if not, why not?
Yeah, so I didn't, and this is really just I think I put out a call for papers and we kind of got what we got and I had to actually trim that down some. But interestingly, I don't think anyone proposed a film that doesn't have any kind of human agency in it, right? So hope maybe there's another volume in the works here. I think it'd
I'm,
be
I'm
great.
just
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, why would John ask that question? Why is the human agency important here?
I mean, I think there are other I think it depends on how the plague starts. So I'm thinking about, I've been rereading Komatsu Sakyo's novel Virus. And there is this contagion or plague that becomes global. It just feels very much like COVID. I mean, this thing was written back in the 60s or something. Um, but that has a human origin. It actually it comes from outer space, and then it gets manipulated in a lab. Um, and so there is some human origin to it. So I guess my question back to John would be, is there no kind of human um, agency there at all, or does this just spread by itself, or how does that work? So
Yeah, and then I'm going back to this question. So because Godzilla comes and destroys, right? So there's this horror moment. It's like an earthquake. It comes and destroys,
yeah,
and that makes Japan the victim of this action, right?
it
And
does. But
because
then
there's an
Godzilla's,
agent, we can then focus on overcoming that thing, I guess, right? So that's very,
yeah.
very interesting.
I mean, what's important too, though, is that Godzilla is initially in the '54 film created by U.S. atomic testing in the Pacific, right? So we can then, obliquely or whatever, how it works in that film, blame the Americans, right? Less obliquely in the Japanese original film for awakening this beast that then attacks Japan.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. We have a question from Ian, wondering whether you could comment on your translation or the book's translation of Hisaisha, in terms of victim, survivor, affected person. I just said victim, right? But that I just said that because I without much thinking or giving it any thought. But is there any reason or rhyme behind how you want to think of the Hisaisha as the recipient of the threat, I guess?
Yeah, I think, and I've done some work on this in an article elsewhere. The use of the term hisaisha is interesting to consider in conjunction with the use of the term hibakusha and the reluctance to use the term hibakusha after the Fukushima disaster. Even though these people were clearly nuclear victims, right? And so there was a reliance on the term hisaisha instead of hibakusha as a more kind of neutral term, I think. So, do we think about them as victims? This really shifts depending on the issue. I know that in the case of Minamata, they're not called victims, they're called patients, right?
Mm,
I think it's kanjasan. So I think the use of those terms, my understanding is varies quite a bit depending upon what the disaster is and what era we're talking about,
mm,
and maybe how it's functioning in this larger system in relation to other terms for victim that may or may not be favored.
mm.
I don't know if I answered the question, but
Yeah. So there's clearly something happening here, right? So there's an agent, a human, an agency. So somebody's doing something, and then somebody is suffering, and then we need to get pulled into suffering with them, I guess, right? Is that's the okay. So we have another question, and audience, thank you for asking these great questions. Vivian would like to know the following. I know Shinkai Makoto's Weathering with You was not covered in the book, but can you give your thoughts on its portrayal of eco disasters, given that it has a story about people trying to play God by changing the weather to their will, but instead end up with Tokyo being flooded permanently and having to find a way to live in such an environment? So, um, uh, I actually don't know uh, of this movie, but maybe you can give us some context. And I guess the question is, why was that not covered, or what does that add to the larger story?
yeah, we were originally hoping to have it in the volume, and then through a series of kind of unforeseen events, it didn't make it into the volume. I teach this film in my Japanese environmental film class, and it's an interesting film because it is about this girl who's this sun maiden, and she is able to create sunny weather for people. And they end up using this, people pay her and she creates good weather for their wedding or some other event or something, gets rid of the clouds. But she's doing it at the cost of her own life. Basically, she's kind of a sacrifice to the gods in a way, right? And then it's a love story like many of his films, and the young woman has there's a young man there who's attracted to her, and he decides to save her at the end at the cost of the weather, right? It could be at the cost of Tokyo, but also the cost of the whole planet. I mean, there's this great scene when he goes to save her up in the clouds and pulls her back down, and the camera is kind of zooming out, so you can see, these larger and larger views of Tokyo and the area, and then the whole globe, the whole planet, right? And it's interesting that his decision to save her then does result in scenes later in the film where you see Tokyo underwater. I mean, large portions of the city completely submerged. And so, is the message that love is more important than environmental disaster? Is it that we can't put the burden of saving the environment on young people? There've been a number of interesting interpretations to that film. And a couple of my students did a really interesting eco-feminist interpretation of that film. Why is it that the young boy or young man gets to decide the future instead of the woman herself, who seems to have this relationship with nature? So there's a lot of really interesting things you can say about that movie, and I regret that it didn't make it into the volume. But hopefully someone will write an article about it. That'd be
Well,
great. Yeah.
there's your second volume there.
There's another
So,
volume out there. Yeah, exactly.
so for those of us who are not actually experts necessarily on, all of these movies, can you comment a little bit on the difference between an anime eco disaster film and a acted one, or whatever, non-anime,
Yeah.
whatever that, with actors and stuff?
Yeah. So, these animated films, I think, can create images of apocalyptic disasters, right? Or these kind of unimaginable futuristic worlds in ways that live action films are not as successful at always, right? Um, I mean, certainly you have, the Godzilla films, which have evolved from the guy in the big suit, into these high-tech CGI films. But I think the animation films, and maybe this is one place where the Japanese really excel, is, because animation is such a large part of their market, because it's also, it's internationally incredibly successful. Um, they are able to produce these images of this kind of futuristic space, right? Or kind of futurist of, post-eco disaster, post-apocalyptic landscape, in ways that I think are a little bit more challenging or can be more challenging for live action films. And so maybe that's something that might be a way that Japan might have a certain corner on that market, but I'm not a specialist in non-Japanese animated films, so I'm a little reluctant to say so.
So, in your introduction, you mentioned that this genre, I guess, of eco disaster movies is a thing now. You had a cover of one in China and other places. Can you help us as a sort of a larger level, like sort of as a literature professor, kind of help us understand that genre? I mean, sort of globally, I guess. But it's not that new. I mean, your movies here go back to the 50s, right? And it's did anybody invent it? Does anybody get credit for the invention? And and so why this interest suddenly? What is the, if you can embed this in a sort of larger story of um uh yeah, I guess literature. Uh,
Yeah, so environmental studies is the bigger category for this, and then under environmental studies we can think about eco-cinema is the term that's commonly
yes.
used, and eco-cinema is, in the context of Japan, environmental studies is not new, but is somewhat newish. But eco-cinema in general is newer, right? I mean, that's really only a couple decades old, and there's been a real acceleration in the number of works, research volumes, and articles about eco-cinema. A lot of that, quite a few of those volumes look at documentary film because, as I mentioned earlier, documentaries have this very clear environmental messaging, right? But that's expanded out, and it's expanded out beyond, I think environmental studies still is very heavily Euro-American based, but those are growing fields in Asia. And there's been an interest in kind of looking at cinema and other forms of media as a means. Are these effective means to transmit environmental messages? Right. And so there, the of the books I mentioned before, there was a heavier emphasis on documentary film, and I wanted to look beyond documentary film to think about other types of films. Also because I think documentary films have a limited audience usually, right? I mean, have a smaller audience. Fewer people are going to go see a documentary film than go see Godzilla, right? So thinking about this as part of the Asia Short series, how can we talk about films that reach a range of different sizes and different types of audiences? And some of those films may be more successful than others, but we really wanted to think broadly about how environmental messages are embedded in or communicated through this particularly visual media.
So it's the purpose. I mean, maybe I'm thinking too much, from a business perspective or something. But is the purpose to wake us up to the disaster, or is the purpose to get us rallying? Right? Is this a rallying cry? If you think of it as a sort of an eco thing, right? Should we watch Godzilla and then go to our local representative and tell them to shut down the nuclear power plant, or is it the opposite, that we watch this in the movies and therefore we don't go and demonstrate against these things? So is there a sense for what these filmmakers or what this genre actually is trying to accomplish?
So I think it's both and all. I think you have films like Kamanaka Hitomi's films. She is really dedicated to educating viewers, so they will go out and talk to their representative. They will go out and protest against nuclear power, right? And a lot of scholars who work on eco-cinema are interested in that very political nature, the political possibilities, right, inherent in these films. But I think a lot of these films also, because they thrill you, they put you on the edge of your seat. Oh my gosh, this is going to be environmental apocalypse, right? But then in the end of the film, it's often contained somehow. Either Godzilla saves the day or someone else saves the day, right? And then that future, that horrific future, kind of disappears, and you feel like, oh, okay, phew, thank goodness, right? That we escaped that apocalyptic disaster, environmental disaster. I don't need to go to my representative to do anything, right? So I think they function in a bunch of different ways. But there is an interest in folks who work on eco-cinema to find a way to, how do we solve the climate crisis? How do we make the climate crisis urgent and persuasive? Because it seems like all the facts we're getting about science aren't necessarily persuading your average person that they need to do something about this, right? And so is the humanities someplace that we can look to for the power of storytelling to motivate people to do something? And I think some films do that and some films don't.
Yeah. Jennifer wonders whether all Japanese disasters are eco disasters, or whether there is what distinguishes this genre, and is it specific to post-war? Because you talked about the Chiso thing, that was actually a pre-war thing, but we didn't have movies then, so I don't know. But so there are other disasters that are not eco, or is everything kind of put into this basket?
I mean, I think it depends how you define that disaster. I was particularly interested in looking at this genre of disaster films that Japan is so well known for, and thinking about how those films could be environmentally themed, right? And as you mentioned, that this is not just a post-war thing. I mean, the Minamata goes back before the war. And some people talk about, this era of the Anthropocene as, starting with the industrialization, right? Industrial revolution. Some people talk about starting with the nuclear. So I don't know that everything has to be an eco disaster, but we were interested in making these connections between films that talk about disasters and also have some kind of environmental commentary in them, right? So, we could watch maybe a war film and think about, does that war film, the disaster of war, have environmental commentary in it? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I'm reluctant to say that all films are eco-disaster films. But I do think there's ways to go back and watch films that were not considered to be eco-disaster films and think of them through this lens and see if that's a productive way to view them.
Well, I mean, war is clearly bad for the environment. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, interesting. Yeah, so maybe it's becoming a sort of a catch-all phrase for this sort of disaster thing.
Yeah, I think it's a lens to
Yeah.
it's a tool, right? It's a lens to look through and see if that allows us to see things in these films that we didn't see before.
So, that is interesting. So Shunsuke invites us to do a little bit of a sort of a comparison, a little bit more focused than I asked earlier about the US. So the question is, um, he's curious to know how famous um, Japanese movies related to nuclear power were actually perceived in the United States or other countries. So, for instance, Godzilla 1, what was the perception in the United States? And then in the reverse, is there a different perception on non-Japanese movies about nuclear between Japan and other countries? He reminds us that Oppenheimer took a long time to be available in Japan and wonders why that might have been and whether that fits in here.
Yeah. So the starting with the Godzilla, the first Godzilla original Godzilla film was edited for an American audience. They took the film and they cut it up and they cut Raymond Burr into the film. So, right, Raymond Burr plays this American news agent who's in Japan, and they edited him into the film. And they did also edit out a few comments in the original that make more direct reference to U.S. nuclear testing and the atomic bombs. That was very popular in the U.S. And then that went back to Japan and was very popular in Japan as well. Actually, the American edited version was popular in Japan too. So it's kind of an interesting circle that happened there. Um, the Oppenheimer film, I think my understanding was the Oppenheimer film was delayed in Japan, partly delayed in Japan because of the Barbenheimer controversy. Barbieheimer it was, right? That it came out with the Barbie film, and that was seen as an insult in some ways to the gravity of what happened with the atomic bombings. Um, and that film was also interestingly was criticized. Oppenheimer was criticized. I don't know how much it made it to the American press, but was criticized by indigenous communities in the U.S. as well for completely glossing over the harm to indigenous communities in the U.S. from American nuclear testing here too. So that's an interesting film to think about how that's circulating both within an American context and in a Japanese context.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, I think that's how I remember the Oppenheimer thing. That was the Barbie, the
Yeah, that's how I remember,
unfortunate
but yeah.
simultaneous release. Yeah. Um, so yeah, so I kind of want to go back a little bit to this. What, are there more Japanese eco disaster? Is there more Japanese eco cinema than elsewhere? So I'm still trying to wrap my head around this precarity thing, and so there I can tell you that there are more, as far as I can tell, more office drama movies made in Japan because it's such an important part of the whole salaryman and the women at work, and so and there are lots of these movies that have office settings. In the US, we get some ER or hospital or something, and then we get crime, but we don't have a lot of these office setting dramas. And so I'm just wondering whether is this a Japanese, so I'm going back to my precarity question, right? So is this a Japanese thing or we just have more Star Wars maybe or I don't know whether that's true, but that's my question, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a couple things. I think it's you could look at the films themselves, and then you could look at this as a lens of eco-criticism as a way to examine those films. So, we do have films like Don't Look Up, the American film Don't Look Up, right? About this kind of impending environmental disaster that no one's paying attention to. There was recently an interesting article about Twisters, the recent movie Twisters. There's a New York Times op-ed criticizing that film for not talking about how hurricanes and tornadoes have gotten worse because of climate change. And then there was this huge backlash, interesting backlash against that, as being woke ideology. Um, so, and there's a lot of climate fiction, I think, also in the US too. So I don't know that it's unique to Japan. When you look at the scholarship that's been produced on eco cinema, I would say Asian eco cinema is less prominent than Euro-American works on Euro-American eco cinema. But there's other examples. Okja is, a Korean. There's some Korean films we could talk about that would also be examples of eco cinema. So I don't know. I don't think it's unique to Japan. Um, I think we'd have to think about how the narratives evolve in those stories are different. And so the one chapter where we have the three Godzilla films, the original, the Shin Godzilla, and then the American film. The American film is very different, and the American film really is about this kind of American hero saving the day, saving Japan, saving the world, in a way that the Japanese films are not. And the Japanese films end up in this much more ambiguous place than the American films do. So, you could look more at how do those narratives differ. You were asking earlier about, is it the eco savior film? I think those are a little more likely to be in American cinema than in Japanese cinema. Yeah, hard to
Well,
say.
Jennifer just reminds us of the early Hollywood films like King Kong.
Yeah,
I don't actually remember King Kong. Did King Kong save, or did I don't quite.
I thought King Kong, doesn't he die at the end of don't they kill him in the original film? I don't remember, but yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting.
yeah.
So maybe it did start. So I'm not even saying it's as unique, or did it start there or something. I'm trying to get a larger grip on this phenomenon of this genre, if it's a better word. Um, and uh, and you mentioned earlier about the activism that this might, or the effect that it leaves on the audience, and I was reminded of the German uh, English class where we were doing Shakespeare, and the teacher pointed out that at the time of Shakespeare, why would people go to the theater? Why would people go to the Globe, right? And he said it's to let go of emotions and to live through, and he called it a soul sauna. And so you would go in there and cry your heart out over something, and then you go back home and everything else is not so bad. And I'm wondering whether the soul sauna thing, it's interesting that it stuck in my mind this whole, entire time. But I'm wondering whether there's something to that as well, right? So your daily life is bad. There's been another earthquake or something, or the weather is too hot or too cold or whatever it is. You watch Godzilla and you go home and say, "Oh, this is not so bad. We're
Yeah,
here."
or
You
like I
know,
said, yeah, whew, that disaster was averted, right? This kind of sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. That did not happen, so maybe we're okay.
you may
And
be okay. And
others
yeah,
might say, okay, now I'm going to go out on the street and I'm going to demonstrate against this, right? So it'll affect people, separately, I guess,
yeah,
differently.
and the chapter, Dong Hoon Kim's chapter on melodrama is really interested in this kind of effective response people have to these films. And why is it that in Japan we have to keep having these? You can't just have a regular crisis to bring people together. It has to be, a nuclear disaster to bring this relationship together. So, what's going on? And why do we have to keep ramping things up, right?
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Hmm. So we have just a few minutes left. So kind of the final wrap up question about this. Um, so if I wanted to watch these movies, that's first of all a practical question, very simple question. I'm impressed by all of this. I want to go watch these movies. Are they on Netflix or something?
So I actually thought about there's a list of films in the end, and I thought about putting links to where they're available, but those things are so ephemeral that we decided not to. So some of
Yeah.
them are available streaming. Some of them you may have to go to your, university library to get, and some of them are just going to be really hard to get your hands on, unfortunately. But I wanted to have a range of films in there. But certainly, the Miyazaki films, those you can get your hands on. Some of these other films too are available. Some are streaming on like Vimeo. I know Kamalaka's film is streaming on Vimeo. And some of her films, you can invite her to the US and she'll do a screening for you too, which is amazing. So
Ah, that's interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I personally would have to break this up with some happier,
Oh
happier
yes.
eco things. So, are there any happy eco movies? I mean, there's so much Japanese things with the clean air and the field, and the young loving couple opening up a coffee shop in the middle of nowhere or something. There's a lot of that, right? There's the celebration of the beauty of Japan. But are there any sort of happy eco? Can there
I mean,
be?
I think the Godzilla films in the end, some of them are happy, right? Like Smog Monster, and the
Oh,
Godzilla
yeah,
comes and saves the day, and the little boy, waves him off into the sunset, and some level of happy. Totally happy. I don't know. I'd have to think about if these films are. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. In general, it's not a super happy genre. So
Nah, well, it's a disaster genre, well, thank you very much. We're out of time. You filled up a full hour with eco disasters without making me cry. So congratulations on your compliment. But I want to really recommend this book. It's a wonderful collection of papers, and I wish I had known more of the movies, because kind of reading this without the movies is a little bit difficult, I guess. But even if you don't read the movies, I think this is a very good book, and I want to congratulate again the Asia Shorts series, and I want to thank you, Rachel, for joining us today. And audience, we're not meeting in 2 weeks from now. We're going to meet in 3 weeks from now to avoid the competition with our elections, and we'll have Philip Lipsky to parse out for us the Japan and the changing international order. So I hope to see you then. And until then, stay safe, be good, and have a lot of fun. And thank you again, Professor Denito, for joining me today.
thank you, Ulrika. Thanks everyone for coming.